of competency in the catching of bricks, I experienced it the other way round. Bettelheim and Vettern lived in a wooden barrack with about 125 other Jews, getting what sleep they could on mattresses and pillows stuffed with straw. At the end of the long, arduous days, they would gather around these bunks or in the small living room that, with 6 tables and a few chairs, passed as a recreation area. We bought thousands of books, Vettern told me. We collected money, gave it to an SS officer, and he ordered them. But you needed time and energy to read them after working all day, and we didn't always have it. Mostly, Bettelheim wrote, the inmates indulged in their favorite free time activity, exchanging tales of woe and swapping rumors about changes in the camp conditions or possible liberation. Bettelheim wrote that it was during one of these sessions that it suddenly flashed through my mind, this is driving me crazy, and that he decided to study camp behavior as a way of giving himself something to do to help him maintain his sanity. Bruno had the wonderful idea that whenever we had a chance we should exchange ideas, recalled Hans Bandler, who was a 24-year-old socialist and engineering student when he befriended Bettelheim in Dachau, and was also among the Austrian Jews transferred to Buchenwald in September. On work details when they hoped the guards were not watching, or in the evening if they had strength left, Hans would explain the principles of engineering to Bruno, and the older man would talk of Freud and psychoanalysis and make tentative stabs at interpreting the psychology of camp life. It was a wonderful opportunity to escape from a devastating situation, if only for a few minutes. Bruno seemed to have the intellectual ability to rise above the physical restraints that encased us. First, Vettern wrote that Bettelheim owed his survival to the chance of finding work in the stocking mending shop, where he could live in relative safety. This commando, as the workplaces or details were called, was next to their barrack, and the SS officer in charge was a very nice man, no question, Vettern told me. Bettelheim himself is a person, but he did say that among the SS devils there were at least a few angels. Vettern said he did not know how Bettelheim had been treated in Dachau, but when he met him in Buchenwald he seemed somehow protected. Hans Bandler had the same impression and called the indoor assignment a very, very rare situation. Herbert Zipper, a Viennese conductor-composer who knew Bettelheim in the camps, also concluded that he had a guardian capo. He said that Bettelheim managed to keep in comparatively good physical condition because of his sock-mending assignment, which spared him the crushing outdoor labor most other prisoners faced daily. Bettelheim wrote that it could not be stressed enough that survival depended foremost on luck. He said he himself had been lucky, though he did not elaborate on his special treatment at Buchenwald in his published writing. Nor did he reveal what may have been the main reason for his good fortune, his poor eyesight. Ernst Vettern wrote that, for reasons he could never quite fathom, the SS guards showed some respect for Bettelheim's glasses, like other prisoners who did not see well. Bettelheim wore a special 3-pointed insignia on his sleeve. Twice during my time in the camps I hid, which I could do very well because I had the arm sleeve that declared me as blind, Bettelheim wrote to Vettern 3 decades later, not specifying how or where he had hidden. He said he did not regard going to ground as cowardice, but as a temporary defense, and that in each instance, after less than 2 weeks, he had emerged and taken the insignia off because he found it too self-destructive, and had watched the destruction it wreaked in others. When Bettelheim wrote publicly about his glasses, he said that they had not protected him but had put him at serious risk. They marked him as an intellectual, he said, and on the transport to Dachau aroused the antagonism of the guards, who smashed them. Superscript 1 he wrote that, after arriving at Dachau, he told an SS officer that his glasses had been broken during the transport. When the SS officer heard this he began to deliver a beating and screamed, "What did you say happened?" I corrected myself, saying I had broken them accidentally. At this he immediately said, "Okay, just remember that for the future," and matter-of-factly sat down to give me written permission to receive glasses. Squared on another occasion. Bettelheim wrote that, since he was near blind without his glasses, the physician who attended him at Dachau, not the SS officer, permitted him to write home for new glasses. Having learned my lesson, I requested, and a while later received, glasses of the simplest and cheapest kind. Even so, I found it best to hide my glasses and do without them whenever the SS went on a rampage. I was much safer this way. This is but one of the many precautions a prisoner had to learn to take if he wanted to increase his chances for survival. Cubed in a third telling. Bettelheim wrote that the camp physician who had treated the bayonet wound he said he had received on the train to Dachau had given him permission to work indoors because of his broken glasses. An authorization that had to be renewed every other day by certain officers. They decided to find out whether I was really unable to see by throwing beer bottles past my head. I managed not to move my head, nor to blink my eyes. It is certainly possible that Bettelheim was attacked on the transport because his glasses labeled him an intellectual in the eyes of the guards. But his letter to Federn and his published accounts of the incident do not support his claim that to enter the camp with horn-rimmed glasses was tantamount to a death warrant. Moreover, his camp letters make no mention of broken glasses until more than 6 months after the June 2nd transport to Dachau. On December 20th, he told his mother in a letter from Buchenwald that his glasses were broken and asked her to get a new pair from an optician named Schleffelder in the Graben. He did not ask for glasses of the simplest, cheapest kind but for good glasses, in a good case, and told his mother to write on the package. Permitted mail. In writing about his camp experience over the next 4 decades, Bettelheim never referred to his letters, and he mentioned those he received only once. In an anecdote aimed at showing how prisoners often willfully misinterpreted good news, he said his mother wrote him that a colleague of his had delivered a paper in Vienna using some of his ideas, and that the presentation had been well received. On one level, he knew his mother and the associate meant well and had hoped to buoy his morale with word that his ideas had been accepted. However, the letter sent him into a cold fury to think that my colleague was enjoying success with my ideas while I lived in such misery. Bettelheim's 19 letters do not allude to this hurt, and, with a vagueness that would prove typical of his written work, he did not identify the colleague or reveal the nature of the ideas he had borrowed or the audience that had embraced them. Much of what Bettelheim wrote about the general conditions in Dachau and Buchenwald during his time there corresponds to the accounts of Ernst Federn, Hans Bandler, Herbert Zipper, and others. Especially Bruno Heilig, whose Men Crucified covers the same months Bettelheim was imprisoned. What Bettelheim wrote about his own torment, how camp life impinged on him personally, how he dealt with the daily rigors, how, in fact, he did survive, must be taken almost entirely on his word, since little of what he said and wrote about his actions and reactions in the camps can be corroborated. The difficulty, after so many years, of locating among the thousands of inmates those few living survivors who might have known Bettelheim was compounded by his failure to name his fellow inmates. He did identify Ernst Federn eventually, possibly because he, too, wrote about the psychology of camp life, after spending 7 years in Buchenwald. But Bettelheim did not mention Hans Bandler or Herbert Zipper. He wrote that he asked hundreds of German Jewish prisoners why they had not left Germany rather than submit to the degradation inflicted on them by the Nazis. That he asked more than 100 older political prisoners if they would reveal the horrors of camp life if they were freed and managed to reach safe territory. That, in collecting data for his psychological observations, he came into personal contact with at least 1,500 prisoners in the 2 camps. He was able to interact with so many inmates, he said, because he worked in at least 20 different labor details and slept in 5 different barracks. Given his sock mending assignment, the first claim seems unlikely, the second is untrue. Prisoners were required to write their block numbers on their correspondence, and Bettelheim marked all his letters from Dachau Block 22 and from Buchenwald Block 17. However many inmates he did interview, with the exception of Federn and the passing mention of a man named Alfred Fischer, His subjects always remained nameless and faceless. Bettelheim himself, however, was always a central presence, and nothing in his accounts put him in a brighter spotlight than his tale of dealing with frostbite. On November 7, 1938, Herschel Grinchban, a 17-year-old Polish Jew, fatally shot Ernst von Rath, the third secretary of the German embassy in Paris. As is well known, this act led, on the night of November 9, 10, to the rampage of anti-Semitic murder, arson and vandalism in the Third Reich that came to be called Kristallnacht. An explosion mirrored in Buchenwald by a ferocious crackdown on Jewish prisoners. One new order barred them from the camp clinic, the only place they could obtain treatment for frostbite, which afflicted many inmates, because they worked outdoors in freezing weather with neither gloves nor overcoats. Bettelheim says he, too, suffered from frostbite, and the fear of amputation finally drove him to the clinic. When he arrived, he found that some 20 others had come to have their extremities treated and that most of them had devised an approach to the officer in charge that they hoped would get them admitted. They would stress their meritorious World War I service, or tell some tall story that another officer had ordered them to come. The prisoners seemed convinced that the Gestapo man on duty could not see through their schemes, Bettelheim wrote. Moreover, they neglected to take into account the fact that he might be an individual with personal biases, and that it might be advantageous to appeal to these. Superscript 1 Bettelheim said he himself had no story, and saw no gain in inventing one, because he could not anticipate the admitting officer's personality and prejudices. He said his fellow inmates were derisive and accused him of harboring some secret plan, or of eavesdropping and stealing some of their ploys. When their time came to use those stratagems, the officer became increasingly vicious and turned most of them away, making clear that he certainly could not be taken in by Jews. When my turn came, Bettelheim wrote, the Gestapo man asked me whether I knew that work accidents were the only reason for admitting Jews to the clinic, and whether I came because of such an accident. I replied that I knew the rules, but that I could not work unless my hands were freed of the dead flesh. Since prisoners were not permitted to possess knives, I asked to have the dead flesh cut away. I made these statements in a matter-of-fact way, avoiding pleading, deference, or arrogance. The Gestapo man replied, if this is really all you want, I am going to tear the flesh off. He started to pull with force at the festering skin. Because it did not come off as easily as he might have expected, or for some other reason, the Gestapo soldier ordered me to enter the clinic. Once I was inside the clinic, he gave me a malevolent look and pushed me into the treatment room. There he told the orderly to attend to the wound. While this was being done, the Gestapo man watched me closely. I succeeded in suppressing signs of pain. Squared Bettelheim published this story for the first time in April 1947, in the Dynamism of Anti-Semitism in Gentile and Jew, which appeared in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. 10 months later, he covered the same ground in commentary, this time identifying the tale's insightful and stoic hero only as N and describing him as a trained psychologist, capable of observing the mental processes at work with substantial objectivity. Cued by 1960, when Bettelheim retold the account once more in The Informed Heart, he had returned to center stage. In all versions, the message was the same, that he had achieved his goal at the clinic by treating the guard as a person instead of a Nazi beast. Thus, Jews should understand that they stereotype the anti-Semite at their peril, whether in the concentration camps or in the world at large. To comprehend anti-Semitism, he wrote in 1947, one must concentrate as much on the study of the Jew as on the study of the anti-Semite. The complementary character of their respective roles makes it apparent that the phenomenon is an interlocking of pathological interpersonal strivings. It is impossible to know for certain whether Bettelheim or the pseudonymous N was the brave protagonist of the frostbite story, or whether the tale was another as if. There is no question that conditions grew much harder on Jewish prisoners in the wake of the von Rath assassination, and that many Buchenwald inmates suffered from frostbite in the winter of 1938-39. One of them was Ernst Federn, who said that he could not be the model for N, because his own experience with frozen hands and feet was completely different from that described in Bettelheim's account. He did not recall that Bettelheim had suffered from frostbite at any time, primarily because he was indoors, warm, mending socks. I think he made the person up, Fettern told me. Hans Bandler, who also did not recall anyone going through such a heroic medical episode, found Bettelheim's tale fairly unlikely. Bettelheim's statement in the commentary article that during the fall and winter Jews were worse off than the other prisoners at Buchenwald because they were not allowed to work indoors makes the anecdote further suspect, given that he was able to work inside much, if not all, of the time. Other inmates, both Jews and General Tiles, drew similar soft assignments. In Buchenwald, even more than at Dachau, the Nazis gave capos and block elders considerable sway over their fellow inmates, and bribery was widespread. On November 3, 1938, Agnes Crane telephoned A.M. Warren at the Visa Division in Washington saying that because of Bettelheim's transfer to Buchenwald, Gina was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. When the refugee had first arrived in the United States with Patsy in March, Agnes had installed her in a small hotel near the Crane home on Steamboat Road in Greenwich. Each morning she went to the house to take care of her 14-year-old charge and hear her patron again urge that she make this job her life's work. Gina quickly realized that this was no world for her, caring for the troubled child by day, living in an elegant hotel, spending my evenings singing Gilbert and Sullivan and going around in long dresses, while I got letters from Vienna pleading for affidavits. In July, she and Patsy had moved to Manhattan and into a house in Greenwich Village belonging to Paul Peel, one of Agnes's brothers. During these weeks, Gina occasionally went out in the evening with Paul and also with Fritz Rettel, who had found work with the Rockefeller Foundation after coming to New York City in 1936. When Agnes was in town, she often waited up, knitting furiously, until Gina came home, fueling further the émigré's suspicion that her sponsor had lesbian tendencies. In September, as Bettelheim entered Buchenwald, Patsy returned to Steamboat Road, and Gina at last was able to gain some distance from her suffocating protector. She moved into the servants' quarters of an apartment in Manhattan and found a job at the Community Service Society, a leading social agency. Still, after work on many afternoons she would board a train at Grand Central Station and visit Patsy in Connecticut. Meanwhile, Peter Weinman, who had made it safely to London, wrote Gina almost daily, saying he was trying to get to the United States and that he would leave his wife and marry her if she would have him. This and all the other pressures and worries in Gina's new life, including a brief stay in Cuba that allowed her to return with a permanent visa, soon produced a severe bleeding ulcer, what she called her immigrant's disease. After one collapse, Agnes Crane, though she donated blood, refused to visit her child's surrogate mother in the hospital. She was angry about Gina's affection for Peter, which was upsetting her fantasy of a happy extended family with Patsy, Gina, and Bruno. Despite Agnes's growing disenchantment with Gina, she did not let up on her efforts to help her husband. In early November, Cordell Hull again intervened in the case, setting up an interview at the U.S. consulate in Vienna for Paula and Margaret Bettelheim. Officials there assured them that the Nazis had been told on several occasions that the United States was prepared to grant Bruno a visa. This had produced no movement, so Raymond Geist, the American consul in Berlin, entered the case. On November 12th, in the wake of Kristallnacht, Crane wrote a desperate letter to Warren in Washington, D.C., expressing her fear that the current wild persecution of all Jews in Germany may entangle Bettelheim in such confusion and red tape that he might not gain his freedom for many months or even years. Superscript 1 in Vienna, Paula and Margaret cowered in anguish as the marauding Nazis closed some 4,000 Jewish-owned shops and ransacked hundreds of apartments. Nazi hooligans destroyed 42 synagogues in the city, including the one on the Nüdiger Gasse, where Bruno and Gina had married in 1930. They arrested hundreds of Jews, and scores committed suicide. Squared on November 26. Geist sent a coded cable from Berlin telling Hull that he had formally asked the head of the Gestapo to free Bettelheim. It concluded, "Believe in view of arrest having taken place last May, release will be difficult." Cubed by Christmas, a holiday that the Bettelheims Like most of Vienna's secular Jews, normally embraced with candles on the tree and generous gift-giving, snow and ice had turned Buchenwald into a frigid nightmare. In the days after Kristallnacht, the Nazis sent more than 10,000 Jews to Buchenwald, bringing the total population to 18,000. Many of the newcomers were bankers, industrialists, merchants, and other wealthy entrepreneurs whose homes and businesses in Berlin or Frankfurt had been pillaged, torched, or both. Now this human prey was robbed again. As
the inmates looked on, the SS men plundered in the most shameless fashion those who had been beaten to the ground, murdered, or trampled to death, stealing watches, rings, money, and other objects of value out of their pockets. 85 some 70 Jews went insane during this pogrom within a pogrom and wound up in chains on the cement floor of a barrack that had served as a watchhouse. Guards took them in groups of 4 to a cell block ruled by the handman of Buchenwald, a sergeant named Martin Sommer, who beat them to death. 86 Though the Kristallnacht Jews offered welcome targets for such orgies of sadism and theft, they also presented the problem. By the end of November, the chief of the SS health department was complaining that as a result of the mass arrests the camps were so crowded that an epidemic could break out at any moment. 87 As a result, Himmler soon decreed that all Jews would, in principle, be released if they guaranteed to leave the Third Reich, and an announcement began blaring almost daily over the camp's loudspeakers. The tension barracks law to 5-8. The following Jews to the gate with their belongings. In November, December, and January, the Nazis freed more than 11,000 prisoners, most of them Jews, who came down from the cold, fog, and terror of the Teutoburg and straggled away. 88 The call came for Herbert Zipper and Hans Bangler, but not Bettelheim. For those not summoned, there was the Buchenwald song by Fritz Lohner-Beta, an inmate who had written librettos for Franz Lehar's operas and who would die in Auschwitz. The chorus rose on hope. O Buchenwald, we do not lament and wail, whatever our fate might be. But we want to say yes to life, for someday the time will come when we are free. 8. As several thousands of his Jewish fellow prisoners left the camp during the winter of 1938-39, Bettelheim kept up the pressure on his mother and sister. His concern with getting his financial house in order had by now given way to a frantic effort to satisfy the bureaucrats who held the keys to his release. On October 2nd, he granted his mother another power of attorney, this time to get the still missing papers and passport he needed to leave the country. He said his sister must take copies of these documents to Berlin immediately, underscoring the word twice. Once in the capital, she should deliver the papers to the Hilfe der Rhein der Juden. Founded in 1901, this German Jewish aid society initially helped the persecuted Jews of Eastern Europe, but in the early 1930s began concentrating on the plight of German Jews. By 1941, when it closed down, the society had secured exit visas for some 90,000 persons. Bettelheim urged his sister to find her way to a good lawyer recommended by the society, and also to take copies of his papers to the Kultusgemeinde in Vienna. Letters to the Buchenwald command are forbidden. He reminded his correspondents a redundancy on Buchenwald stationery, which declared in small Gothic type that such pleas were pointless. Thanks for the money, please keep it coming, he wrote in a postcard on November 22nd, urging them again to arrange for his passport, and also to procure his ship ticket. On December 22nd, he asked for more money and reported that the Gildermeister Emigration Aid Society was helping him with his passport. Degrees. He wondered if his mother and sister had gotten him the ship pot, said he wanted, telling them that if the Paris-Cuba-New York-San Francisco route wasn't possible, he was willing to go directly to New York and then San Francisco. Paula Bettelheim marked her 61st birthday on December 21st, and her son sent her greetings and wished one and all a Merry Christmas. On January 8th, he wrote again, enclosing photos to be used for his passport and visa. If they needed notarization, he urged his mother to go to the Gildermeister operation in Weimar and have it done. In the same letter, Bettelheim instructed his mother to send $950 to a Frida Goldstein at Fehrbelliner Strasse 19 in Berlin. This transfer is a matter of honor for me and because of the very important. On January 15th, he asked Paula to confirm that she had sent the money, then ot more but $950 for certain. On February 5th, he asked, "Did you transfer the $950 or not? Please make sure." He also told her to transfer $300 to a Dr. Klein at Hohenzollernstrasse 1 in Saarbrücken. He said Klein would pass this payment to a woman named H. Wagner sent her at Passages Strasse 6 in the same city. By March 19th, he was telling his mother that she had misunderstood his directions and that she should send only $600 to Berlin and $300 to Saarbrücken. Under all circumstances, these are debts that, if they are not paid by you, will have the most unpleasant consequences for me. This cry strongly suggests that the money was required not to settle any debts of honor but to lubricate whatever Nazi hands were holding up the prisoner's release. Bettelheim said years later in an interview that a large sum of money changed hands before his captors set him free. Superscript 1. He supplied no specifics, but Maria Peers told me that some kind of payoff may have been made. She and her husband, Gerhard Peers, had known the Bettelheims slightly in Vienna. By the time Bruno was transferred to Buchenwald, the Peerses had managed to take refuge in Switzerland. Gerhard, a fledgling analyst who had served as a resident in a Viennese mental hospital, found employment in Basel as an assistant to Heinrich Nab, the German minister-turned-psychoanalyst who had published books with Paul Federn. At the time, Bettelheim was the only person the Peerses knew personally who remained in a concentration camp. Maria said that through Nab her husband contacted a woman named Bochley, a Swiss lawyer with connections in the Gestapo, and enlisted her help in trying to ransom Bettelheim out. She charged Nab for her services, and he paid Gerhard's salary money directly to her. Maria Peers said she did not think the ransom money itself came from Nab but was passed through him, possibly from Agnes Crane or Paula Bettelheim or one of the several rescue committees operating in the United States at the time. It is certainly possible, even likely, that Frida Goldstein in Berlin and Dr. Klein and Frau H. Wagner Center in Saarbrücken played a role in this transaction. Maria Peers said that she and her husband never learned whether the money actually triggered Bettelheim's release and that, though both he and they eventually settled in the same neighborhood in Chicago, he never talked to them about how he got out of Buchenwald or thanked them for their efforts. On March 4th, Bettelheim wrote that he now assumed from his mother and sister's reports that his papers were at last in order. One must have very much patience and not lose hope, he told them. One indication that he had not lost hope was his request that they send him a book called Colloquial English, which they succeeded in doing. He referred to Gina in almost every letter from Buchenwald, always urging his mother to write to her saying how much he loved and missed her. He was pleased to learn that she had found work in New York City and asked how much she earned per month and whether she could live well off her salary. "How are my other friends?" he added. "Do I have any left at all? So far, I am not bad, and happy that the winter is over. Hopefully there will be nicer and better times." Bettelheim's final letter from Buchenwald, dated March 19th, contained his plea that the money be sent to Berlin and Saarbrücken lest he face the most unpleasant consequences, and instructs his mother to renew his ship ticket at 14-day intervals and keep everything ready for his immediate departure. Bettelheim would write that on 3 occasions during the winter and early spring of 1939 Buchenwald officials told him that he would be released. The first time, most of the inmates called up with him were freed but he was sent back. The second time, almost all the prisoners were returned to their blocks. Bettelheim said that when he was beckoned the third time he refused to be put into civilian clothes, because I was convinced it was just another effort of the SS official to break me. But this time the call was authentic. Superscript to Buchenwald records show that Bettelheim was scheduled to be freed on February 23rd. The most likely reason he was not was that on that day the authorities declared the camp infected with typhus. Superscript 3. Normally, Nazi doctors did not get overly concerned about the disease, which they often recorded merely as catarrh of the stomach and intestines. But the fever had spread to nearby communities, and the district doctor in Weimar had insisted on a quarantine, which, under German law, could not end until no new cases had been reported for 6 weeks. Bettelheim did not touch on this development in writing of his camp experience, though it was a topic of passionate speculation in Buchenwald, as prisoners seized on every rumor that there were or were not new outbreaks of the infection. Meanwhile, Bruno wrote, hundreds of inmates were put in the breast with the same needle, which was not sterilized even once. No one was so much as asked whether by any chance he was suffering from syphilis. 5 for Hitler, the typhus at Buchenwald was a definite inconvenience. He had decided that on his 50th birthday, April 20th, he would reduce overcrowding in the camps by freeing more prisoners in an act of amnesty. In early March, an order went out that the typhus must be stopped, and not long thereafter commissioners appointed by the Reich Ministry of Health proclaimed that the epidemic was abating. As word spread through the camp about the April 20th pardon, prisoners began thinking of their tormentor as their savior and started wishing him happy birthday in advance. On the evening of April 11th, word began circulating that the quarantine had at last been lifted and that another wholesale exodus would start soon. The next morning, the news came, and from that time onwards, with the exceptions of Sundays, not a day went by without releases, varying in number between 20 and 100. 6. The Nazis freed Bruno Bettelheim on April 14th, warning him, as they did all Jews, that he faced arrest if he did not leave the country within a week. 7. All the details of how Bettelheim's release came about may never be known. Agnes Crane's determined efforts on his behalf can be traced through documents in his visa file at the National Archives in Washington, but only until the end of 1938. It seems safe to assume that she did not give up after that, but either the Archives or the U.S. Department of State has misfiled, lost, or destroyed the records that would help illuminate her effort as it continued through the first 3.5 months of 1939. In 1945, Bettelheim told the War Crimes Tribunal that his release was effected through the aid of some influential friends of his in America who were able to enlist the assistance of the State Department of the United States. 8. But for more than 30 years thereafter, he chose not to discuss in his articles about his concentration camp experience, or in The Informed Heart, his 1960 book on the subject, how he managed to get out of Buchenwald. In 1979, Bettelheim wrote that he had no idea why he was among the lucky ones who were released, speculating that it may have helped that one of the most prominent American public figures intervened personally on his behalf. He never credited in his writing either Cordell Hull or Agnes Crane by name, possibly because he never learned of the firm's efforts and because he feared that naming the latter would risk identifying her troubled daughter. Sometimes he left the impression that he had been all but abandoned after entering Dachau, saying that few of his friends at the time did anything more than write a note how sorry they were. Superscript 1 degrees. Other times he said that the intercession of Eleanor Roosevelt and Herbert Lehman, then governor of New York, had helped free him, a story that over the years took on mythic proportions as he repeated the claim to family members, colleagues, and journalists. Mrs. Roosevelt asked the American ambassador in Berlin to intervene for me, he told one interviewer in 1988. Superscript 1 degrees. Superscript 1. No supporting evidence exists in either the Roosevelt or Lehman papers to show that they helped Bettelheim in any way, though it is possible some indication of an involvement is, or was, contained in the absent visa documents. In later years, Bettelheim would maintain that the intervention of notable people in his case actually could have delayed his release, because the Gestapo might have concluded that he would be useful as a hostage. Superscript 1 degrees. Superscript 2. In his published work, Bettelheim wrote nothing about the days immediately following his release. However, toward the end of his life, he offered some details to his literary agent, Farrah Rains, who was working on a book about his client. He told Rains that the deprivation in the camps had left him totally bald, and that he had lost half his body weight, emerging from Buchenwald at 75 pounds. He had been so starved that for a while after his release eating too much at any one time brought on nausea. Bettelheim said that when he arrived back in Vienna he found his mother living with a friend, the Nazis having thrown her out of her apartment at Neubau 66 and taken it over as they had hundreds of other residences. When officials came to evict her, she had already disposed of almost all her possessions but had kept 3 packing cases of crystal and Dresden china that had been in the family for years and that she hoped to take with her if she ever managed to obtain an immigration visa. Bettelheim told Rains that, when his mother urged a police officer inspecting the cases to be careful, he picked one off the table and inverted it, so that its contents shattered on the floor. Bettelheim's visa had come through 10 months before, largely thanks to the persistence of Agnes Crane. But, he told Rains, when he went to the U.S. consulate in Vienna, officials said that the quota under which he had been accepted was now filled. They held out the possibilities of immigration to the Philippines or Shanghai, but not to the United States. Bettelheim said he left the building and went to the Central Post Office and cabled Crane. The next day, he returned to the consulate and a different official approved his application, pending a physical examination and a visit to the Gestapo. Bettelheim told Rains that when he went to that headquarters, the officer who interrogated him was Adolf Eichmann. Bettelheim said that the Nazi asked him to sit down, but that he had learned what such offers really meant and stayed standing while Eichmann asked a few questions, stamped his papers and dismissed him. Superscript 1 degrees superscript 3 in a 1988 interview that touched on the same days in Vienna. Eichmann made no appearance. This time, Bettelheim said that he had to report to Gestapo headquarters every day before he left the country, and that he had to sign a paper saying he had not been mistreated in the camps. He said one officer conceded that this was not true and then told him that when he got to the United States he should never forget that the Nazis didn't have any Negroes in Germany, implying that they treated the Jews, as the Negroes. Superscript 1 degrees for Bettelheim wrote that he did not tell people about life in Dachau and Buchenwald, not so long as I or my mother was still on German soil. All I did tell others was to get out of Germany in a hurry. That is how little my science spoke as long as I had to fear being returned to the camp. Superscript 1 degrees 5 years after Bettelheim's ordeal, he would write about the agony of survivor guilt and of how the realities of camp life induced me or optimistic moments I like to think, forced me to do things that would not stand up to well under closest scrutiny. Superscript 1 degrees 6 beyond disclosing that he paid bribes, he never revealed in his published work what these acts were. His deception about a roll of his glasses and his failure to describe the sock mending assignment suggest that he felt ashamed because his poor eyesight, which had so embarrassed him since childhood, had won him a warm refuge for at least part of the winter of 1938 to 39. While most other prisoners worked in the death-dealing cold. In general, Bettelheim's published accounts of his 10.5 months in Dachau and Buchenwald deserve skepticism, but doubts about their veracity do not mean that what he suffered was anything less than hellish. Just to be separated from one's family, to have one's worldly possessions stolen, and to be robbed of one's homeland was bad enough. To be sent into the Nazi gulag, even before the war had started and when the ovens were more than 3 years away, was cruelty unimagined. No one who did not go through the experience was in any position to criticize Bettelheim's behavior at the time, to judge him for seeking to improve a desperate situation by using to best advantage his poor eyesight, the money he received from home, or any other strategies he could devise, including those he did not reveal because they would not stand up to well under closest scrutiny. If, after settling in the United States, he had become just one more obscure survivor, telling his camp stories to friends and neighbors only, his distortions would not matter much. But the accounts became the foundation on which Bettelheim would construct an international reputation as an expert not only on the camps but on the Holocaust itself, a role he pursued aggressively all his life, often with an I watch their pugnacity. His writing and speaking on the subject brought him much publicity and made him, in the minds of many, the leading authority on how one survived the camp ordeal. In arguing his positions, he often claimed the high moral ground, attacking the views of others and delivering stern indictments of Otto Frank and his family and the European Jews in general for not resisting their Nazi persecutors. An accusation dealt with at length in Chapter 15. Superscript 1 degrees 7 Now Bettelheim was on the verge of freedom. From Vienna, he made his way to Antwerp, and on April 29th sailed on the SS Gerolstein of the Red Star steamship code. 181 passengers crammed the liner, the largest number it had ever carried. 116 of them were refugees from the Third Reich, many, like Bettelheim, listed on the ship's manifest as Hebrew 30, 8 others were natives of Spain fleeing Francisco Franco's fascist regime. Bettelheim described his mental and physical health as good, put down his occupation as merchant, and said he planned to reside with Agnes Crane on Steamboat Road in Greenwich. In answer to the question whether he planned to return to Austria, he said no, adding that he intended to become a U.S. citizen. At noon on May 11, 1939, the Gerolstein docked in Hoboken, New Jersey, across the Hudson River from Manhattan. Superscript 1 degrees 8. I remember the exhilaration of walking the streets of New York, he recalled years later. It was a hot summer day, with blue skies, the sun was shining. At that moment, I felt I would make a new life for myself very different from the old one. Superscript 1 degrees